So now comes a moment that many of you were looking forward to. Commissioner Vestager, we're thrilled to have you with us. We're enormously grateful for your presence here once again. We know that deep down, the reason why you wanted to stay as commissioner was that we would invite you again to the conference. And I showed in the morning that your popularity has done very well since you started coming here. But if you remember last year, I said that we would be inviting you no matter what happened with your professional future. You probably remember that. And I hope you will remember that because we hope to have you with us for the next 5 years too. So today we're celebrating the 10 years of Chilean competition, but in the future, I'm sure we'll do a conference to celebrate the 10 years of Margrethe Vestager. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, congratulations on the 10 years. As said, I will try to follow you on that. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I find it to be an exciting moment. It's just a few days ago the Commission made its fresh start under the leadership of the first woman president. Sometimes, though, a new start can be a little bit bittersweet. The joy of starting new challenges can be mixed with the sadness of leaving good friends and colleagues behind. So I feel very lucky to be back here today with the promise of another 5 years in which I'll be able to work closely with this wonderful community of competition experts. But I don't see the next 5 years ahead of us as just an opportunity to more of the same. You can never step in the same river twice. Businesses today, obviously, are increasingly global. And that means huge new opportunities for Europe's businesses. But it also means that they have a lot more at stake. And globalization can offer a better deal for consumers, but only if competition keeps working as it should. Meanwhile, digitization also creates new opportunities. New companies with millions, even billions of users has emerged from basically nowhere in the last decade or two. And even that is just a very small part of the transformation that is affecting every part of our economy. And these changes, they create an earthquake in our markets. They've helped some companies grow very, very large, while made it very difficult for others to compete. And so it's no surprise that in the last few years, questions about the future of competition enforcement have moved right into the mainstream of European debate. And that discussion has put some very important issues at the table. There's been valuable questions about how to keep competition working in a world where you sometimes depend on data to be able to compete. We've seen very interesting discussions about who exactly global businesses have as their competitors. And it is true that at times the debate can be a little bit contradictory. We hear at the same time, and sometimes even from the same direction, that competition enforcement is both too strict and too lenient. On the one hand, we ask to do more, to act faster, to stop big tech companies driving out competition. On the other, we are told that by taking firm action in defense of European customers and businesses, we're stopping some companies in Europe from reaching the scale that they need to be world leaders. But that doesn't take away the importance of checking whether our way of enforcing the rules are still right for this new world. The challenges we are facing at the start of this new decade, well, they mean that we need to look again at the tools we use to enforce competition rules. That is not to say that we need fundamental changes in the rules themselves. It is true that our world is changing fast. But human nature doesn't change that fast. The fundamentals, the fundamental motives, like greed and fear, those things that tempt companies to harm competition, well, they are the same as they have ever been. And the competition rules, well, they are still well designed to deal with them. But even when a musician knows and trusts her instruments, she still takes the time to tune it before a concert. And that is what we need to do right now, to make sure that everything is in tune so that we can give our best performance in the years to come. We've already started that process in the last Commission's term of office. We are reviewing the antitrust rules on vertical agreements between different levels in the supply chain. And we have valuable input from the consultation we ran in spring. We just launched a review of the rules that deal with horizontal agreement between competitors, so it's clear when rival companies can work together to produce better results for consumers. And we're also carrying out a full fitness check to evaluate whether our state aid rules are fit for the future. But there's one thing that isn't yet part of that work, but which keeps coming up in discussion of competition policy. And that's the very first step that we take in every competition case, defining the market. At the end of 1997, the Commission sets out the principles for doing that in a notice on market definition. And that notice still applies today. But of course, a lot have changed since 1997. Changes like globalization, digitization, means that the markets work rather differently from the way they did 22 years ago. In that time, we've also developed and we have refined the techniques that we use to define the boundaries of the market and the kind of evidence that we use. And experts, like the 3 special advisors who prepared the report on competition policy in the digital era last spring, well, they have drawn our attention to new challenges with market definition. So the time has come to review the market definition notice. We want to be sure that the guidance that it gives is accurate, up-to-date, and sets clear and consistent approach both to antitrust and merger cases among different industries, and of course in a way that is easily accessible. And we want to give everyone a chance to set out their views in detail during the review process. As we set out on this journey, we will not allow the term market definition to create the wrong idea about what it really is that we're doing. Because the term market definition can give sort of the impression that competition enforcers make choices about how we think that the market should be. That we do not have a magic wand that allows us to define the boundaries of a given market. What we do when we define markets is to study the very complex interplay between product characteristics, consumer and supplier behavior, firms' substitution decisions, and regulation, among other things. And on that basis, we try to answer the very fundamental question: can consumers turn to someone else if prices go up, quality go down, or innovation stops? Defining markets isn't like agreeing on a border between 2 countries. by drawing a line on a map. It's more like charting a coastline. The shape is already there, and it's our job to try to measure it as accurately as we can. And nothing we do changes the shape of the coastline in itself. But it does develop as time passes on. And we can see some general ways or trends in the way that markets are developing. The achievements of the single market by knocking down barriers that once divided Europe's national markets from each other has made it much more likely that consumers will be willing to turn to suppliers anywhere in the single market. The growing ease of global trade, together with the power of digitization, can make it easier for customers really, truly to benefit from global markets. And this, of course, can have an effect on the geographic scope of markets. In 2002, 2003, we found that markets, geographic markets, that could be as wide as the single market, or of course wider, in almost half of merger cases. By 2017, 2018, the figure was close to 2/3. And we can find, when we return to a market after many years, that we need to update our ideas about where the market boundaries lies. In 1991, Alcatel bought Teletra, an Italian company that made, among other things, telecom equipment. And the Commission found back then that the market for this equipment was still national, because, among other things, there were different national standards when it comes to telecom equipment. But the thing is that market has now opened up. Standards for telecom equipment has been harmonized, first within Europe and then across the world. And so in later decisions, we found that these markets covered at least the single market, if not the entire world. So there are genuine trends in the way that markets develop. But our job is not to deal in generalizations. Our job is to understand the options that consumers really have by looking in detail at how specific markets work. A product like cements, for instance, it costs so much to transport it that very often there's no point in trying to buying it from a plant that is much more than a couple of 100 kilometers away. So the markets that consumers can rely on can be very small. And the fact that cement companies are global businesses with rivalries in many countries doesn't change that reality for the consumer. So it doesn't make much sense to lay down a general rule for every market, to say, for example, that all markets now have become global. Instead, we need to look at each market on its own merits. Of course, it's very important that we know whether the way we do that assessment is appropriate. That is why, back in 2015, we asked two independent competition economists, Bruce Lyons and Amelia Fletcher, to take a look at how we define geographical markets. The main message of their report was that we're on the right track. They believe that our way of defining geographical markets is generally in line with the latest economic thinking and the practices of other leading competition enforcers around the world. At the same time, they also offered some suggestions as to how we could do things better. For example, they suggested that we could make it clearer that the market definition is not an end in itself. It's a valuable starting point for our work, but it doesn't mean that we ignore competition that might come from outside the market. Earlier this year, to give you an example, when Tata Steel proposed to merge with ThyssenKrupp, we looked at whether imports from other countries, including China, might keep prices down for steel consumers in the European market. In that case, it turned out that imports didn't have the quality and the reliability that they have needed to be a genuine alternative to steel made in Europe. But the principles, they remain that we can and we do look at what is happening outside the geographical market. And I completely agree with the two economists that we should be clear about this. And our review of the market definition notice will give us a chance to take stock of this and a range of other issues and to explore ways to update and improve the way we deal with geographic market definition. But the changes in market definition and the challenges in that, of course, isn't just about geographical markets. The changes that we are going through, well, especially digitization, are also creating new challenges for defining product markets, for working out which products consumers are willing to substitute for one another. I have tried to avoid it, but there is a thing about being a commissioner for competition for 5 years. You pick up a bit of the sort of lingo. And part of that, and I really appreciate it, is the snip test. Yeah, can't help it. And this, of course, is the idea that you can see how the boundaries of the market lie by seeing which products people would shift to if prices they were to go up for the products that they are used to using. But the trouble with a test like this is that it's linked to changing prices. So it cannot be used for products that consumers are using for free, or at least where there's no obvious monetary payment. In our case involving Google Android's mobile operating system, for instance, we had to deal with the facts that Android is accessible for free. So there is no price that we could use for a snip test. So instead we asked ourselves, well, what will happen if Google reduced the quality of Android a bit? And we found that it wouldn't make consumers switch to Apple. Without a certain expertise, well, they might not even register the lower quality. And if they did, the cost of switching to Apple would seriously discourage them from doing so. Costs like buying a new smartphone, downloading new apps, transferring their data in a situation where the provider may not even enable portability. And because of that, we concluded that Google's dominant position for licensing Android to smartphone makers wasn't affected by the existence of Apple's iOS. And digitization also raises some challenging questions for the way we define product markets. Very often we find that big digital businesses, well, they don't just provide one or two kinds of services. They're often active in a full range of different areas, providing consumers with an ecosystem of services. And they are all designed to work together very well. And as the special advisors pointed out in their report, it can be difficult for consumers to switch from one ecosystem to another. So there may be times when we also need to look at the way these ecosystems can leave consumers locked in. And questions like this will be among the things that we'll be able to look at when we work for the review of the market definition notice. So there's a full range of interesting questions ahead of us when we launch this process. And we'll need to draw on the experience that comes from many different angles, from public authorities, from consumer groups, from businesses, from individuals. And we'd also need you, Europe's competition experts, because no one is better at understanding how competition works or spotting the difficulties that competition rules need to be able to deal with. In the last 5 years, the debates, the discussions, those have helped to make competition law enforcement work even better. And I count on you on the same rich debate for the next 5 years to come. Thank you.
Any burning questions? This is your chance.
Thank you, Commissioner. Simon van Dorp for Politico. Last week, the news was announced that you opened an investigation into Facebook and Google's data practices. Some people in the data protection community have voiced concern that the competition enforcers may be stepping on their turf. I don't know if you could give an idea about how you see the interaction between competition and data protection for your new mandate. Thank you.
Well, obviously we come with different mandates, but one cannot exclude that at some time there will be cases where data protection becomes a competition issue and maybe also the other way around. I think we have very obvious examples where things are basically about consumer protection data issues, like the fine that the Hungarian Competition Authority, I think in their capacity as consumer protection authority as well, they gave Facebook a fine for misleading information that the services was indeed for free. That, for me, is quite straightforward. That's a competition issue. One of the things that I have been enjoying very much is as the data protection community develops and becomes stronger and stronger, the outreach to see if there are issues we should work together, just as well as issues where we would be completely separate. Because these are separate issues. Competition law enforcement, protection of data, these are separate issues. But of course we look if protection of data of the individual is used one way or another, if there is a risk of breaking competition law. So far, no obvious cases, but definitely a profound respect of the work that the data protection community is doing, because this is very important, and I think it's close to every citizen how to be able to do that. Because I don't know if you share with me, I find that it is great to have sort of digital citizens' rights. I would feel even better if I was able to actually enforce them. So, no, I admire what they do, and wherever we could help, we would help. But definitely not try to do what they are doing, because it's a great challenge that they have.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Excuse me, Philip Andrews from McCann Fitzgerald. I was wondering if I could ask how you propose to, or hope to promote convergence, particularly with your US colleagues in enforcement in the coming years, particularly in respect of the major digital players.
Would you repeat the question? I heard it more as a wish.
So I was wondering how you propose to promote enforcement, convergence with particularly US enforcement agencies in respect of your enforcement in the online marketplace and digital sphere.
On both sides of the Atlantic, we're too busy to try to do each other's work, but never too busy to share experience if asked. And we, of course, do that. We tell about our cases if we're asked about them, what are our reasoning, how does things work. And of course, it is with pleasure I see the initiatives by both the DOJ and the FTC. I think it's also important what we do in the international competition network, that we discuss practices, how things are approached, because when it comes to big tech, it's not just a Europe-US thing, it's a global matter. So I think both when we share things and in the very specific cooperation that we have, whenever we have the relevant waivers from companies, but also when we have a global discussion about this, because I think indeed these are global issues.
I'm Kayo from Lexion Publisher in Berlin. I'm just wondering if you can give us a little bit of an idea of how much this new college is willing to go to make these changes happen. So are we going to look into extremely big pieces of legislation, or are we expecting more softer instruments, or just how far are we, can we expect this to go to solve these, all these challenges that we're mentioning?
It's heavy rain. Well, on that note, we also hope that competition and competition law enforcement can bring the best when it comes to fighting climate change, but that's for another conference, at least for my part. Now, what we have been doing in the last mandate was, of course, to try to see specifically where we think that things are at stake. For instance, looking in the Microsoft-LinkedIn merger, to look in the Facebook-WhatsApp, the Shazam merger, sort of look in the specific cases. And then, of course, do the antitrust enforcement, which we continue to do. But as said, the time has also come to see if our notice on market definition gives the right guidance, that people can see how we are working, what to expect from us, and especially when it comes to other things than geographic markets, product markets, markets where there's no obvious price.
Commissioner, hi, Kushita from PAR. You talked about market definitions, and a few months ago you also mentioned sort of the Commission handing out guidance on mergers, a mergers guideline. With respect to this, growing debate on European champions and industrial policy and competition enforcement, I was wondering if there's any kind of merger guidelines that is imminent now that things are sort of set in place for the new Commission to work.
Well, as mentioned in my intervention, it's a very diverse debate when it comes to mergers. Sometimes you hear basically two different views from the same source, that we are too strict and too lenient at the same time. Some say that we are too strict. Other people say that we are, if not too lenient, then at least we should stay on track. So I think that debate is a very mixed debate and probably shows the need to have competition as one of the important features of the European market. Of course, as we've been discussing, maybe this is not so much a discussion about how to do internally in the European market, but more a question about the willingness to stand up if European businesses are faced with unfair competition outside of Europe, which is why we are working on a number of different issues with US and Japanese colleagues in WTO to be more firm on harmful subsidies, because that is definitely a way to go. Within Europe, to make sure that we can deal with foreign subsidies if they go into businesses that are located in Europe as another form of unfair competition. So that would be more the direction of travel, to make sure that when we ask fair competition of businesses in Europe, well, then we also stand up for businesses when they are faced with unfair competition here or outside of the European market.
But pure merger guidelines from the Commission, would we see a document at any point?
Well, now you have a revision of the notice of market definition. I think that's enough for a day.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I need to find the right way to address you now, Madam Executive Vice President, I think it is. Not too bad. In my TED Talk earlier this morning, I spoke also about the merger control regulation, but not so much about substance and Siemens, Alstom and the Chinese and all of that, but about process. And there are lots of, well, how should I say, requests or dreams that we practitioners have to make the process more streamlined. Is there at least some, policy, how should I say, policy initiative going to come in the next year to work on that, to try to make the process smoother, to try to twist perhaps a little bit the best practices guidelines, possibly the implementing regulation, and some of the other things which shy away from the big substantive debate which has been triggered by the Franco-German, Polish, etc., and many other manifestos?
Well, we are always looking into that. I think that is why the huge majority of mergers go through simplified procedure. That's exactly to make sure that if we don't need an in-depth evaluation, well, then things can go through simplified procedure. Also, when it comes to the antitrust cases in particular, that we work on the way we give access to file. So that when the very first document is put in the file, that you think about how to be able to give access to this material whenever, if ever, a statement of objection is sent, in order to be able to pass that in a swift manner that has full respect of due process. Because this is one of the things that can make things take a very long time, which is why we work with confidentiality ring, to give you one example, as to how to make sure that we can actually process things. We do not make things complicated to make them complicated, neither for lawyers to bill more hours. What we are trying to do is, of course, to get it right. And this is why we ask so many questions. This is why we very often are interested in internal documents from before a merger, for instance, was announced, because then we tend to get a better feeling of what was the idea and the business rationale. So it's a question for us of getting it right, and of course we're open for suggestions as to how could this be done better, because what we want to do is, of course, to see the right cases where there are tricky things that risk to be harmful to consumers, not to see everything on the contrary. So suggestions are welcome, because this is a work in progress. But I think it's important to keep that as a thing that we do all the time, instead of saying that now we want to look at everything, because a lot has been done already.
I'll take one more last question.
Wow, last question, what a privilege. Linking back to the speech before yours, and also knowing that environment and climate change and things like that are very high on the agenda of our brand new commission, I wonder, in terms of the thinking you're doing, you said you're thinking through geographic aspects of the market definition analysis and the market definition notice. Are you also thinking through environmental sustainability impacts? I mean, ways of taking that into account in the antitrust and merger analysis, as we heard in the prior speech. Is that something that you're thinking through in terms of formulating and thinking about new guidance? Thank you.
Right. Sometimes that is tricky because yes, to some degree, but also no. Because when it comes to fighting climate change, it has to be something that we do before a merger, during a merger, a process after a merger. You cannot just hang it on merger proceedings to do that, because whatever businesses, whether they merge or not, should be part of the fight against climate change. That being said, we have been working a lot with energy efficiency, improving energy markets, support, subsidies for transformation when it comes to energy production in the state aid area of the work that we do. And I think that has been helpful because one of the reasons why, in particular, state aid control comes in very handy when we want to fight climate change is that it allows us to do it in the cheapest possible manner, for instance, by using competitive bidding, that we don't crowd out private investments, because fighting climate change is definitely not something that we can do by public investment on its own, on the contrary. And last but not least, that we keep a level playing field within Europe. Because also that is part of sort of the driving forces to fight climate change while at the same time have an economy that works for all. So you see it, yes, in some instances, but also that sometimes even the very strong tools that we have, they shouldn't be asked also to do climate change, because fighting climate change is for everyone, no matter their customers by our teams or not.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. I think we're done. No more questions. Good. Well, it was fantastic. Thank you so much.